I'm good. How about you?
We seem to be doing a lot of these events.
Yeah.
More the merrier for us.
Good afternoon and welcome. On behalf of the Chairman of the Helsinki Commission, Senator Wicker, and Co-Chairman Congressman Smith, I want to extend a very warm welcome to those of you that have braved the cold to make it here in person, and then also those of you watching online. My name is Nathaniel Hurd. I'm a policy advisor for the Helsinki Commission. And I want to say just a quick word about format. Our first panelist, Ambassador Michael Kozak, actually has a hard stop at 3 o'clock. So after introducing our panelists, I'm going to turn it over to him for opening remarks. I will then ask him a series of questions. He'll answer them. I'll then open it up to questions for him from our fellow panelists, as well as to those of you in the audience and those of you watching online. It is a delight to begin with Ambassador Kozak. He is a longtime friend and colleague of the Helsinki Commission. He actually led the delegation to the HN meetings this past fall, and by all accounts did a fantastic job. So it's good to have you here. Ambassador Kozak is a charter member of the Career Senior Executive Service in the United States government. He has served in a number of senior positions in the U.S. executive branch, including Senior Director of the National Security Staff from 2005 to 2009, as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State-level positions in 3 different bureaus, Acting Assistant Secretary of State for extended periods of time, Ambassador and Chief of Mission in Havana, Cuba. Ambassador Kozak was a U.S. negotiator with Cuba to secure the return of criminals sent to the United States during the Mariel boat crisis. He also helped implement the Camp David Accords and negotiate the withdrawal of the PLO from Lebanon. Ambassador Kozak has been awarded the State Department Superior Honor Award, Younger Federal Lawyer Award, Presidential Ranks of Distinguished and Meritorious Executive, and the Order of Balboa presented by the President of Panama. He received his A.B. in Political Science and Law degree from the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome. Dr. Daniel Mark is the Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He is an assistant professor of political science at Villanova University. There he teaches political theory, philosophy of law, and politics and religion. At Villanova, he is a faculty associate of the Matthew J. Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good, and he holds the rank of battalion professor in Villanova's Navy Reserve Officers Training Corps Unit. For the 2017 through 18 academic year, Dr. Mark is on leave from Villanova as a visiting fellow in the Tocqueville Program for Inquiry into Religion and Public Life at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Mark is a fellow of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, and works with the Tikva Fund in New York. He is also a member of the Advisory Council of Canevas. He has served as an assistant editor of the journal Interpretation and is a contributor to the Arc of the Universe blog. In addition to his academic writing, Dr. Mark has published on topics related to international religious freedom in U.S. News and World Report and other outlets and publications. He holds a BA, MA, and PhD from the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Before graduate school, he was a high school history teacher for 4 years in New York City. Welcome. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Kathleen Collins. Dr. Collins is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Minnesota. She is the researcher for Central Asia for the Under Caesar's Sword Project, pioneered by the University of Notre Dame, and the Religious Freedom Research Project at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown University. Focuses on the repression and persecution of Christians globally. The project's book, edited by Daniel Philpott and Tim Shaw, is forthcoming with Cambridge University Press. Dr. Collins is the author of Clan Politics and Regime Transition in Central Asia, which won the Central Asia Studies Society Book Award for Social Sciences. She has published articles in various journals and edited volumes, including Comparative Politics, World Politics, the Journal of Democracy, Europe and Eurasia Studies, Political Research Quarterly, the Brown Journal of International Affairs and Asia Policy. She is currently writing 2 new books, tentatively titled The Rise of Islamist Movements, Islam and State in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and Muslim Politics, Islam, Politics, and Public Opinion in Post-Soviet Kyrgyzstan and Azerbaijan. Collins has received grants from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the MacArthur Foundation, the Kellogg Institute, the United States Institute of Peace, IREX, and the National Council for Eurasian and East European Research, among others. And then finally, we'll hear from Philip Brumley. Brumley is the General Counsel for Watchtower Bible and Tract Society of Pennsylvania. He received his law degree in 1988 from Brooklyn Law School in New York. He has represented Jehovah's Witnesses in the U.S. Supreme Court and the European Court of Human Rights. Additionally, he supervised the filing of complaints to the UN Human Rights Committee that resulted in 15 favorable decisions. In addition to his work on behalf of religious freedom, he is an instructor at the Watchtower Bible School at Gilead and the School for Branch Committee members in Patterson, New York. Ambassador Kozak.
Well, thank you. There we go. Thank you, Nathaniel. And thanks to the Commission for holding this briefing on religious freedom in the OSCE region. Religious freedom is a cherished American value, universal human right, and a Trump administration foreign policy priority. I'd like to open by saying that the Department is hopeful that the Senate will soon confirm Governor Sam Brownback of Kansas to be Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. Governor Brownback, former CSCE chairman and commissioner, is the highest-ranking government official ever nominated for this important post. He brings great commitment and experience, and including having been a key sponsor of the International Religious Freedom Act, we could not ask for a more distinguished nominee. Now, turning to the conditions for religious freedom among the OSCE participating states, as head of the U.S. delegation to HDIM in Warsaw in September, it was my privilege to present the statement on freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief. I made the point that freedom of religion is an animating foundational principle of the United States, and that the right to believe or not to believe is embedded in our Constitution and integrated throughout our national and state laws. At HDIM, we were also very clear about our concerns in the region. In the OSCE region, the State Department has designated Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan as countries of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act for engaging in or tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. The other countries so designated are Eritrea, Sudan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Burma, China, and Vietnam at one time. We have active dialogues with these countries to encourage them to take concrete steps to ensure that freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief is fully enjoyed by all. We anticipate that the latest rounds of country of particular concern designations will be finalized in the near future. In Turkmenistan, members of religious minorities reportedly have been beaten and imprisoned for beliefs the government considers unacceptable, particularly unregistered Protestants, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Muslims the government views as extremists or Wahhabist. We are aware of one Jehovah's Witness prisoner of conscience, Bahram Hamdevov, and there is an unknown number of Muslims imprisoned for their religious beliefs. Religious groups there encounter significant obstacles to legal registration. In Uzbekistan, we've welcomed the government's public expression of interest to work with us to be removed from the CPC list. We view it as positive that the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of conscience, freedom of religion and belief recently visited Tashkent and enjoyed high-level meetings. Concerns about religious freedom conditions in Uzbekistan include how people may be detained, questioned, and fined for gathering to discuss their religious belief outside of government-authorized locations. In Tajikistan, over 100 people have been detained for membership in banned religious groups, and a number of individuals were subjected to long-term imprisonment for so-called extremist views. The government restricts children under 18 from attending public religious service. Tajikistan is the only country to enforce such a restriction nationwide. In Kazakhstan, a country that previously had a well-deserved reputation for religious tolerance, we've seen continued negative steps with proposed legislation that would severely restrict religious education, discussions, and literature. We urge the government of Kazakhstan to bring existing and proposed laws into conformity with Kazakhstan's international commitments on human rights. We're closely monitoring proposed amendments on the religion law in Kyrgyz Republic. As currently drafted, the amendments would give the government more control over religious group and place further restrictions on proselytizing and registration. We have pointed out in HDIM and elsewhere that Russia is misusing anti-terrorism and anti-extremism laws to suppress religious freedom in unprecedented ways, raiding houses of worship and homes and harassing, fining, jailing, and deporting members of religious minorities. NGOs have identified at least 111 persons as of 2016 imprisoned for their exercise of religious freedom, many of them on, again, so-called extremism charges. The Russian Supreme Court banned the Jehovah's Witnesses as a, quote, extremist organization on April 20, 2017, and upheld this decision again in July. A Danish member of Jehovah's Witnesses arrested in Russia and charged with so-called extremism remains in detention for holding a religious meeting. The government of Azerbaijan continues to detain religious activists who local human rights groups deem political prisoners. The government considers as non-traditional groups such as Jehovah's Witnesses and Muslim minority groups, and they face difficulties in legally registering. Adherents cannot freely practice their religions without risking police raids, fines, detention, arrest, or prosecution. In Turkey, authorities continue to limit the human rights of some religious groups, and some communities continue to experience protracted property disputes. Non-Sunni Muslims, such as Alevi Muslims, do not receive the same governmental protections as those enjoyed by recognized non-Muslim, and those enjoyed by recognized non-Muslim minorities have faced discrimination and violence. Some foreign citizens, including several individuals with ties to Christian groups, face detention, problems with residency permissions and visas, and so on, under the state of emergency following the 2016 coup. The United States continues to advocate for the immediate release of Pastor Andrew Brunson, a U.S. citizen who's been wrongfully imprisoned in Turkey since October 2016. Today, religiously motivated manifestations of hate are persisting, evolving, and erupting in unprecedented ways around the OSCE region. Anti-Semitic violence continues to rise, giving new urgency to the need for participating states to respond with immediate, definitive action. Both age-old and contemporary forms of anti-Semitism are afforded unprecedented reach by the use of mass media, including online technologies. At HDIM, we urged all governments to denounce and combat anti-Semitism and work with Jewish communities to better protect them. The OSCE continues to benefit from the expertise of Rabbi Andrew Baker, the personal representative of the OSCE Chair in Office on combating anti-Semitism, and also Director for Jewish Affairs at the American Jewish Committee. We are also deeply concerned about intolerance and violence towards Muslims. There's a growing trend of the governments across the OSCE region and elsewhere imposing restrictions on the ability of Muslims to freely practice their faith. Good data is essential to developing good policies. The United States supports the work of ODIHR's Hate Crime Unit in its efforts to collect comprehensive data. We also encourage participating states to work with civil society to develop strategies for addressing the problem of underreporting. In addition to HDIM, we work closely with the U.S. Permanent Mission to the OSCE to combat religious intolerance and coordinate policies and statements. At OSCE, for example, we've raised the targeting of members of religious minorities such as the Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia and called upon Central Asian governments to bring their laws into conformity with their obligations. In closing, I'd like to emphasize that we appreciate the Commission's focus on international religious freedom issues. It greatly strengthens our hand in diplomatic efforts on behalf of religious freedom with foreign governments, that this fundamental human right enjoys such deep, broad, and steadfast and bipartisan congressional support. We want to continue to work closely with the Commission to help protect and promote international religious freedom in the OSCE region. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Kozak. So I will ask a basket of questions. After you answer them, I'll open it up to the panelists and for our audience. As the U.S. government representative, I'm sure you can expect that you'll start off in the hot seat, but things will hopefully get a bit cooler as we proceed. I'll ask you 3 baskets of questions, several of which focus on countries in particular.
Okay.
So the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act requires the State Department to issue the annual International Religious Freedom Report on May 1st. The Act also requires the State Department to issue its designation of countries of particular concern no later than 90 days after issuing the IRF report. This year, the Department released the IRF report on August 15th, more than 3.5 months late. The deadline just passed for CEC designations, and no designations have yet been issued, although they've alluded that that will happen soon. So I guess one question would be, why have there been delays, both regarding the report and CEC designations, and then do you expect to issue these by the end of the year?
Okay, on the delays on the reports, this is a bit of damned if you do and damned if you don't. We were criticized this year for issuing the human rights report exactly on time, but not having the Secretary participate in it. The IRF report, we waited until the Secretary could participate because he really wanted to participate in the rollout, but trying to get schedules aligned and so on with senior level officials results in a delay. So it's always a trade-off between which way we go. We can send the report, but then you lose the impact of having the Secretary roll it out. And I think, as any of you who saw the Secretary's rollout of the IRF report this year, it was pretty powerful. I guess I would say worth waiting for. So that is what happened with respect to the report itself. With respect to the CPC designations, I have to take responsibility on that myself because it's the actions of my bureau. We have not gotten the paperwork to the Secretary at this point for decision. People like to, think this is due to some, titanic bureaucratic battle going on, but it tends to be more mundane stuff. As we were talking a little before the hearing, when the new Frank Wolf Act was rolled out, it included some additional categories, for example, a special watch list, entities of particular concern. And as we were moving towards getting all of our package together, it suddenly dawned that there were, for example, a definitional question of what does severe violation of religious freedom mean. In the IRF Act, particularly severe violations are defined. It's not there, so we had to work with the lawyers to come up with what would be a reasonable and supportable interpretation of that would be consistent with congressional intent. It also turns out that the entities of particular concern, the way the statute was drafted, it didn't modify the IRF Act, so the existing delegations of authority don't apply to it. So now we have to work with the White House either to get that authority delegated or for the president to exercise it personally. So those are the kinds of things. It's not that the secretary is incapable of doing this. We were incapable of getting the paper to him on time. I think we're pretty confident we're going to have it up in the near future and give him the opportunity to consider it and make the decisions. But the apologies for being late is on us.
The International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which you alluded to, requires the president to take actions from the list provided in the legislation, including even sanctions, for any country where there are severe restrictions on religious freedom. However, it only requires sanctions be taken or some commensurate action if the country is designated as a CPC. The Frank Wolf Religious Freedom Act requires the U.S. government to provide fuller and more frequent responses when waivers have been exercised. The U.S. government also has a range of authorities, including the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act for imposing sanctions on individuals for religious freedom violations. Generally speaking, has the State Department found any particular sanction or action more or less effective in global religious freedom restrictions? So that's one question. Second question would be, is there a good model for judging the success of religious freedom diplomacy? And then finally, does the administration intend to use the full range of authorities available to it to sanction foreign persons, so individuals, suspected of particularly severe religious freedom violations regardless of whether they are on the list required by the Frank Wolf Act, and regardless of the time of year, sort of recognizing this can be done at any point
Yep.
during the year.
Let me try, and I may have
Sure.
forgotten part of the question, so please remind me. I'll try to start with the last first. The Global Magnitsky Authority is something that's really important, and that's relatively new. We're in the process now of gathering up names and identities of persons that would qualify under the terms of that act, including some that have engaged in religious freedom violations, and some are for other forms of human rights violation. But I think, in my own experience anyway, sanctions that target individuals, senior level individuals, their families, their cronies who provide support, tend to have sort of give us the most leverage effect that you can get for, broader, like national level trade sanctions and so on become part of the scenery. But when you bring it down to somebody has their assets blocked in the United States, or their family can't go to college in the United States, or can't come shopping here, or whatever it might be, it becomes a source of concern for them. To me, the metric is, are we able to use these to actually leverage improvements in human rights conditions, or in this case, specifically in religious freedom conditions in other countries? And trying to make that linkage and get people off the list is sometimes difficult, but this is something that our Office of Religious Freedom really has worked hard to do. It's not just to put people on the list for a punitive sake, but instead going to them and saying, if you want to get off the list, which most of them do, it's just as a reputational thing, it's not good to be on the list of CPCs. And that probably has as much leverage as any specific pain we inflict on it. But it's saying to them, okay, here are a menu of the kinds of things you would need to do in order for us to consider taking you off the list. So it's trying to keep that linkage between the punishment and the crime, and what kind of improvements would get you from where you are to not being on the list. The waiver issue is another matter, and I think, as you were mentioning in the Act, there are two types of waivers. One is when we feel that waiving the sanction would actually be in the interest of the purposes of the Act. So I'd say, like, the time you would use that is, the country has done a bunch of really bad things, but they have a change of regime and they're negotiating a bunch of reforms. You don't want to hit them with a sanction right now. You want to encourage them to do the reforms that we're looking for. That we have not used, at least not very much. I don't think ever, actually. The other one is a national interest waiver, and it's the much more mundane thing that you have a country that's engaged in egregious religious freedom violations, but we're also depending on them to allow us to transit military supplies through their territory to a theater of war or something. So in that case, the waiver is simply a trade-off, and usually explained as such. I think that perhaps what has happened with some of the acts is, it just says the Secretary determined it was in the national interest not to apply the waiver. Obviously, we'd be happy to come up and give a more in-depth briefing. I mean, that is the determination he makes, is that very, like, one sentence type thing, but the reason behind it is something that people in our regional bureaus, and as well as we, would be happy to go into. But I think it's fairly obvious where you see the ones that we've made waivers. All three of the Central Asians, it was Northern Defense Network, where we were supplying our troops in Afghanistan through their territory, and that was the trade-off. So it's not a way of saying or lessening the condemnation of their religious freedom violations. It's saying they did it, they deserve to be sanctioned, but we're going to forego that because of these other considerations. And those do not rule out then, going after somebody individually, or, using Magnitsky or one of our visa authorities.
And of course, one of the advantages of the Global Magnitsky Act is that it is a law that other countries can model in their own right. And to the extent that they see the United States implementing it faithfully, hopefully it will inspire them to do likewise, which means that these individuals not only are not able to, are denied access to the United States and to our financial systems and markets, but also in other countries as well.
Yeah, I think where Canada has been adopting a similar law, so that's very much to the good. And that's actually another, when you ask about effectiveness of sanctions, is the more allies you can get, the better on these, because denial of access to the U.S. financial system is a big deal. But if you're also nailed from travel to the EU countries and other to Canada, and you just start restricting the scope of activity for one of these evildoers, it amplifies what we're trying to do tremendously, and so something we always encourage.
One more set of questions before opening it up to our panelists to ask you questions and then to the audience. The governments, some of which you've mentioned already, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Turkey, regularly invoke security to justify violating the religious freedom of groups and individuals. In your view, and I would say in the broader view of the U.S. government, does protecting and promoting religious freedom generally enhance security, including to combat terrorism and violent extremism, if religious freedom violations perpetrated by these governments have undermined security in their countries? How so? And then, are religious freedom violations in these countries isolated, or are they part of a broader pattern of infringement, restriction, violation of fundamental freedoms like freedom of assembly and freedom of expression, part of sort of a pattern of attempting to control the citizenry?
Yeah, again, last first, and very much so that I can't think of a single case where the violation has just been against religious freedom and they allow freedom of assembly and speech and political openness and all of that. It all goes together. It's all governments that are trying to suppress legitimate political opposition to them, and they're afraid of anything that's not under their control, basically. Our view is very much that respect for human rights, and including religious freedom, is fundamental to securing peace and prosperity in a country and not having, not creating a breeding ground for terrorists and so on. My own experience, I got into human rights work not because I was a human rights activist, but because in the 80s I was trying to figure out how to counter Soviet-backed insurgencies in Central America. And a lot of us were saying, just backing these military governments that are out slaughtering their citizens right and left isn't getting the job done. The people hate the insurgents, but they hate the government as much or more than they hate the insurgents, and that's not a way to win a war. So it's not only good human rights doctrine, it's good counter-terrorist doctrine to be respectful of people's human rights. And this is something that it's not just the office or the DRL Bureau out there promoting it. Our colleagues in the Counterterrorism Bureau and in the Political Military Bureau and so on are making the same message. Our colleagues in the U.S. military, because that's the way you win wars. And what you've got in this case is a bunch of governments that are, charitably you would say misguided, thinking that by suppressing what they view as extremist thought, which is anything that deviates from the government-approved line, that somehow is countering terrorism. I think in most cases, the less charitable view is that they're just very afraid of any grouping of people or any independent thought that could possibly turn against them, so they justify it in terms of fighting terrorism. It's not that they don't have terrorist threats. I mean, most of these governments do, but they're treating entire swaths of their population as if they were terrorists when they're people who want to do nothing more than just practice their faith and associate with their colleagues. So that's our doctrine that we're pushing very, very hard, and sometimes with some success, sometimes with less than we'd like.
And it seems particularly counterproductive in instances where you have individuals who are imprisoned, tortured or otherwise abused. We hear, whether it's in the OSCE region or in other places, they become especially susceptible to recruiting from terrorist groups, violent extremists, etc.
Absolutely.
When they entered prison, they had no thought of these kind of activities.
Yeah, no, the prisons are a great recruiting ground, but it's a broader recruiting thing, that when people see their co-religionists imprisoned for, supposedly for terrorist acts, just because they didn't go along with the government-approved version of religion, or where they, likewise, if they won't let peaceful political opponents express themselves freely and all of that, people start to say, the only way I have of trying to defend my community or advance my views is to join the terrorists, because they're at least doing something about the problem I perceive. So if the government shuts off all other ways of trying for people to try to modify their situation, it ends up making terrorists a lot more popular than they would otherwise be. And this is something that it's not philosophical. It's empirically you can show that over and over and over again, and yet we still have a lot of governments that adhere to the opposite view. But it's, as I say, it's something that it's not just the human rights are saying that. It's our military and counterterrorism people, because it's absolutely in our interest that governments learn to open up a little bit.